This is the Digital Marketing Experts Podcast episode. No, why am I trying to sound like a radio announcer? Experts in the Wire, episode 65. Vanessa Fox. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 65 of Experts on the Wire. SEO is a weird field. There's no official school certification or standards that you really need to know to become an SEO, but what I don't understand is why what's in this episode that you're about to hear is not required material for all people calling themselves SEOs. You see, despite ranking factors always changing, there are still core fundamentals to how search engines discover, crawl, and index content, basically how the search engines work. These pillar concepts, they're not as much of a black box as ranking factors. They're fairly known and accepted. So every time I study the idea of crawling, I feel like a much better SEO than I was before. And I think for anyone calling themselves an SEO or really wanting to feel like they understand search, you need to study this stuff too. So, of course, this intro is to compel you to listening to this entire episode every minute, but that's not hard for me to sell to you because I really believe in the strong importance of what you're about to hear. If you'd like to receive personal emails directly from me in your inbox with SEO tips and show notes, you can go to evolvingseo.com/wire where you can sign up for that email list. If you'd like to jump right to the discussion about crawl budget, you can go to the 14-minute, 50-second mark. Vanessa and I did spend the first little bit of this interview talking about her background and some other fun SEO stuff. Either way, sit back and relax and enjoy today's interview with Vanessa Fox. Vanessa, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to back up a little bit and just talk a little bit about your history in SEO. You said in a talk you gave that you actually wanted to be a journalist, and I'm curious how that interest led you to being on the on like a technical side of SEO. Like, how did you make that transition from wanting to be a journalist to then ending up in SEO?
Yeah, right. That's quite a transition. Yeah, you may have seen something. I gave a lot of talks to a lot of journalists, and I gave a bunch of workshops at the National Press Club and that kind of thing. So that may have been something that you saw, because for sure that's always been an interest of mine. I think what always attracted me to that is what has really attracted me to everything else I've done, which is learning about stuff, investigating things, and then really synthesizing the information, right, to take all these different pieces to see how they fit together. And so just in terms of what I've done, I did want to be a journalist. I learned pretty early on that that's not necessarily a great way to make a living. This was back in the early 90s where things were very different too, right? I mean, we've seen this evolution of the print world to the online world. And I think that my interest in that and involvement of that for sure has helped me in what I have done, right? Because when you look at even today, a lot of companies, if they contact me with SEO issues, a lot of times it's because they started as being, a print publication or thinking about things in that way. And it's very hard sometimes to see what you really need to be doing online, even though at this point it seems like it's been forever, right, since we've been online, but that still tends to be a primary sticking point. So anyway, it's all at the end, it all ultimately helps you, I think. But yeah, in my case, I ended up instead being, instead of a journalist, a technical writer, because that's a way to write and still make some money. Yes. And I ended up through there getting into, marketing and product management. And I started building like websites for companies in like 95, like way kind of back in the early days. And when I was doing that, a lot of the products that I worked on were for a developer audience. So early on, I was working on APIs, networking systems. And so I really got involved on the technical side very early, even though I was doing a lot of marketing and product management work. So once I started working for Google, I was really able to pair both sides of those things, right? Understanding the technical side and engineering, as well as understanding kind of the marketing side and audience analysis, UX part of things from the other side of my work. So it really ended up being a nice complementary set of skills.
That is an interesting point. I hadn't realized that. And you just mentioned the curiosity tie-in really makes sense, because I think some of the most successful SEOs have that curiosity. So
for sure, right? You really kind of have to investigate and really like to look at different pieces of data and figure out how it really all works together.
So in one of your talks, you mentioned something really fascinating, and we'll get to the crawl budget stuff in a moment, but I wanted you to share this with the listeners. You were talking about the inverted pyramid. And so for the listeners, that's a style of writing in journalism. But you said something interesting regarding where this technique came from. Can you talk about that just for a second?
Yeah, if you're not familiar with kind of the journalism history, a lot of people aren't necessarily familiar with how this works. And I learned about this. I think this might have been the talk that you saw. I did an internship in high school at a newspaper, and that really showed me the practical nature of journalism, because until then I had a very starry-eyed view, right? Like it's all to save the world, and newspapers exist, which they do, exist to really shine a light on things and this whole thing. But as an intern, what I learned is that newspapers also exist to sell ads. So the more things, will change, the more they stay the same, right? So newspapers exist to sell ads. And so I would see these articles, right? And for me, I would write these lovingly written, fully investigated, spend hours on, talking about a school board, meeting or something that, but I would spend so much time. And, when they would paste up the paper, they'd put it on these poster boards, right? This is in the 80s. So they'd stick it up on these poster boards with glue, and then the person who placed the ads would come and place the ads. And if there wasn't enough room for the ad, they would just take an X-Acto knife and just snip off the bottom of the article. Wow. So you had to have the most important information that mattered at the top, because anything you had at the very end could for sure get just completely, overwritten by an ad, even back in those days. And so it couldn't be like a novelist writing a short story, right? Where you would save kind of the most surprising and exciting part for the last paragraph, because you never knew if that would be there. So that was one of the reasons that you would write journalistic stories that way.
That's so interesting, because I always thought it was, and again, being a little starry-eyed myself, I always thought it was just because that made the best writing. You don't bury the lead. You get the reader interested at the beginning. But it was actually
attention from the news.
Right. Yeah. It was actually because of selling ads, which is super interesting to me. So
yeah, I couldn't believe it, because the editors and the writers weren't even involved at that point, right? Like it wasn't like the ad sales would say, oh, we need more room. Do you want to move this article around? Because at that point it was already printed out, right? There was no moving sentences around. It was just chopped. So like that part of it, where the fact that people who wrote the article weren't even involved, didn't even know what was happening, that was a real shock to me.
That's super interesting. So you also had a really short stint at Zillow. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but in your LinkedIn bio, it said you enjoyed time drinking coffee and singing. And just my curiosity, wanted to know, what is that all about?
Well, I still drink a lot of coffee.
Yes. A lot of SEO-like people do that.
Yeah. And I live in Seattle, where we all drink a lot of coffee. I used to really live on coffee. I've tried to get a little bit more healthy. I still have to drink a lot of coffee. Yeah. So yeah, I wasn't there very long. I mean, that's a great company. And they're doing really interesting things now, for sure. But yeah, well, I had a nice time while I was there, for sure. It's a fun spot.
Was there really singing? That's what I was really curious about.
Yeah. I can't, no comment on the singing.
Okay. All right. That's fine. We'll move on. So I want you to just tell the listeners quickly about where you're at now. You're at Key Lime Toolbox. I believe that's your company.
That's right.
I think you have some search tools. So just tell us quickly about that, and then we'll get down to the crawl budget stuff I want to get into.
Sure. So Key Lime Toolbox has basically two main tools, the query analytics and the crawl analytics. And this came out of, when I worked for Google, I helped launch the Google Search Console, which was not called that at the time, but that's the current name for it in XML sitemaps. And a big part of that is the query data, right? And then, and so, obviously at that point I was really involved in that and understanding the value of that. And then at some point, right, when Google stopped passing the referral and data to analytics on programs, and we started to get this not provided, I saw that as a way, well, we can use the Google API to get as much of that data as we can, and then bring the Google Analytics data in for that. So a big part of the query analytics product was out of this idea of, well, there's a need still to really understand what audiences are searching for. I'd written a book called Marketing in the Age of Google, which was all about how to use the query data to understand your audiences. And I was like, oh, well, if you don't have that anymore, it makes it really hard to understand audiences. So that part of the product is really aimed all at that, understanding audiences through the queries they search for. And then the crawl analytics product, again, when I worked for Google, a big part of, at the time, technical SEO has gotten a lot more interest over past years, but early on, SEO was thought of much more as being
link building
marketing thing. Yeah. Well, yeah. And I saw that when I talked to the search engineers, at Google, like, what are the problems you're seeing in terms of why people don't rank? Many, many times it came back to technical issues. And that was not a big part of what I saw at that time in the world of SEO discussions. Right. And so I really early on, was pushing a better understanding of technical SEO. And there were others that were doing that as well. And so what I found is that log analysis, really understanding how the search engines crawl your site, gave you this really great insight that otherwise was invisible to you. And so the crawl analytics product basically sets up server log uploads nightly. So those just automatically get uploaded. They get, processed, and then you get both nice graphs and stuff that show you what's happening over time, but you also get Excel files that give you a lot of details about all kinds of crawl issues that may be happening. And that's a product that we're actively spending a lot of time on now to really kind of build a lot of the insights in. And I use that so much, right? Like without that, I feel like I'd be blind. Right. So that's kind of the basics of what those tools do. And so it's been fun kind of building that out and seeing what people really find useful.
All right, let's get to crawl budget. And I just want to set this up a little bit. So for the listeners that don't know or haven't caught on to the fact, you worked on the Google Webmaster team, and you actually helped launch two very well-known tools that are in Search Console still today. What are those two tools that you helped launch?
Oh, I don't know. I launched a bunch of them, so I don't know.
So in your we're gonna be talking about your post about crawl budget, and in that, and let me open up the link here. You reference, I believe, the crawl
adjust settings, right? Faster, slower.
You say they're now called crawl stats and crawl rate.
Crawl stats and crawl rate. Yep.
Yeah. So how does it feel, or do you not even think about it, to know that thousands or millions of people are using these tools that you helped create? Is that like a cool feeling?
It is. For sure it is. Because I have talked to so many people over the years that are just lost, especially small companies, but even larger companies that are like, we just have no idea what's going on, and can be a very stressful situation, right? And so knowing that I've helped hopefully shed some light on that and have stuff out there that people still actively use, it's great, it's great to feel like you've been able to, help people. And now, of course, before I worked for Google, I was involved with marketing and websites and stuff, but I was not involved in SEO specifically, right? And so I really learned about the specific challenges SEOs have really in that course of working for Google and talking with people. And so since I've left Google, I've done a lot more on the SEO side of things, right? Where I've helped people out and so I've seen things from the other side. And so I think, oh yeah, God, like if we didn't have all this stuff, what would people do? Like it's hard enough as it is, but with, I can't imagine being in this industry without having some of that information. So
it must be some really great, unique insight. Yeah. You published this really great article about crawl budget. And by the way, Vanessa, if you don't have it open in front of you, I just gave you a link there in Skype. You start off by kind of defining crawl budget and what this actually means by putting it into context for how Googlebot works as a system. So can you first break that down a little bit? What is Googlebot as a system doing in relation to the URLs?
If Google can't discover your pages and then can't crawl your pages, obviously they're never going to ever rank, right? And so a lot of times I find that people try to figure out, why isn't this page ranking? And they really need to start back at this part. So yeah, I think understanding how this infrastructure works can really be helpful. So it kind of has this process where these different parts of the system work together, right? It's not just one system. So there's a system at Google that discovers URLs. And a big part to understand all of this is that Google doesn't think of pages, they think of URLs, right? So you might have a page that could be accessed by 100 URLs, right? So they're always looking at everything from a URL perspective. Can
you explain that? Does that mean that there's technical duplicate content where the same content lives on multiple URLs? Is that what you mean?
Right. Right. And that often is by design, right? Like you might have a parameter that's like a tracking code, right? And so you might have, the version of the URL without a tracking code, and then you might have it, referral equals, Twitter, referral equals, Pinterest or something. So, that could be by design where there's a lot of different, like parameters. You might have this with a commerce site where you have like sort orders, sort by highest price versus lowest price. It's still the same content on the page. And then there's lots of other things. You might be able to access the site through HTTPS, www, without the slash on the end of the URL. So sometimes the case, like it could be uppercase or lowercase. So You might see all that as a page, but from a Google perspective, all of those are distinct URLs.
You mentioned a few ways that Google discovers the URLs to begin with. Yeah. And what I really want to spend a little bit of time making sure the listeners understand is like, a lot of people wrap all of this stuff into one thing in their head. They just think, crawling, right? But like, that's what I love about this post is you're breaking it down. So the discovery of the URL is very different than the indexation of the URL. So what are the ways that they discover the URLs?
So we start with this discovery process, right? And so one way is XML sitemaps, right? They're going to take all of the URLs that you submit there. They're going to take all the links on your site, right? So they're going to crawl your site and try to find all the links. Links, obviously, from other sites to you. But then they do other stuff. So, for example, sorry to interrupt. I'm probably going to do some interjections here. Sure.
Because I hear these questions a lot, and I want the listeners to get some insight as well. Do you feel like the XML sitemaps are a strong suggestion for discovery of URLs? I've kind of heard that they're a lightweight signal that they don't always pay attention. Are these actually really a strong signal for discovery?
Well, for discovery, they're 100%. But this is the thing, is that discovery does not mean the same as crawling, does not mean the same as indexing, does not mean the same as ranking.
Really? So discovery is different than crawling?
Absolutely. Huh. That's right. So from a discovery process, meaning it's a URL that they know about and therefore put on the list of pages they might crawl.
Interesting.
It's 100% used. Any URL they find anywhere is used for discovery, and they'll take that. Now, I think for XML sitemaps, so that was, one of my products at, when I worked for Google. So I know a lot about how the sitemap system works. They use all that for discovery. Whether or not they actually crawl the page, though, which we'll talk about as the second part of this process. There are different signals that Google will use for crawling. So they, will basically put all of the pages or, all of the URLs into like a priority order to figure out how to crawl them. And so the fact that a URL was discovered from a sitemap gives it a little bit of a boost. It doesn't mean that it will for sure be crawled, but it's one of the many signals that they'll use, which is, oh, this page was in the sitemap, so they must care about it in some way. There must be some value. So that's how a sitemap might be used from a crawling perspective. And then from a ranking perspective, it's not used at all at that point, right? It's only used for discovery and then to some extent for crawling. But I get a lot of questions from people. Well, I put it in the sitemap. Why isn't it ranking? Why is this other page ranking what I don't have in my sitemap? But so, well, it's not really used for that, right?
Right. Okay.
So sitemaps have lots of other values too, right? Like you can put a lot of your markup in them and that type of thing. But it also, when we talk about the budget itself, right, which is part of that, is making sure that the bots aren't spending time on pages you don't want crawled. That goes back to sitemaps, right? You want to make sure that your sitemaps have only the canonical values. You don't want to have a lot of URLs that aren't the canonical or that redirect or whatever, because that's a signal to the bots that those are the pages that they should prioritize. So there's some things you can do for efficiency.
So I'm walking through your post here, and I want to make sure I stay on track with that too. I try to balance interjecting with questions and making sure by the end of the hour we get through all the posts. So you talk about that. One reason this came up is Google wrote about this because a lot of people in the SEO land say crawl budget. But in fact, Google clarified that it's actually two different terms, crawl rate limit and crawl demand. Right. And so we're going to talk about those in a moment. And then you have a heading here in your post that says, should I care about this? Is any of it actionable? So I want to address that first for the listener sitting here saying, okay, they're getting technical. Maybe they're starting to fade in and out with trying to understand all this stuff. I recommend you check out the post so you can read it as well. But tell us about not only why we should care about it, but who, right? So should all sites care about this, large and small? How does that work?
Well, so like you say, it's this combination of things, crawl rate and crawl demand. And so if your site is very small, then it may not matter as much, because even if the crawl rate is low and even if the demand is low, if there's not a lot of pages, then they're probably going to get to all of them. Now, whether your site is small or large, though, if you're finding a couple of things. One, if you're finding that not all of your pages are indexed. So let's say you have a small site, so you think, oh, it doesn't really matter. I don't have very many pages. But if you're finding a lot of them aren't indexed, then it's like, oh, well, there could be some infinite crawl loop issue happening, or even though you have a small site, this is causing a problem, right? So that's one thing. If you have a very large site, like a commerce site, let's say Amazon, right, that has tons and tons of products where in aggregate, long tail really matters, then this is always going to be important, because you're always going to want, you're never going to get 100% of your site crawled, right? So the more, the better. Then the other thing you might look at is, even if your whole site is indexed and even if your whole site is ranking, if you're finding that it doesn't get updated very often. So let's say you update your content or you update your homepage, but the old content is in the index. And if you look at the cache date, maybe it's a month old. Well, that also might mean that there's a crawl issue, because Google can't crawl your site as quickly as you might want. So this matters not only because you might update your content and want that to be reflected, but if you're doing SEO work and you want to know, okay, I'm going to make all these modifications, how long is it going to take for me to see an impact in my search rankings? That's going to be very dependent on if your site is quickly crawled or not. Because obviously, none of the changes you make are going to make an impact until Google recrawls and reindexes that content. Yes. So there's a lot of different ways this might impact a site, and so a lot of different things to look at to see if it matters to you. But if your site is fully crawled and indexed, ranks well, and gets updated every day, then you probably don't have to worry about it at all.
Yeah. So, but it sounds like everyone should be aware of it, and then especially if you're a medium-large site, you need to be looking at these things. And we're by the way, we're going to get to some actionable items that you have for the listeners at the end. So, okay, so let's define these two terms. So it's not just when people say crawl budget, they need to start thinking about two things: crawl rate limit and crawl demand. What is crawl rate limit?
Yeah, so crawl rate limit is more of a technical thing. So Google does not want to take down your site, right?
By crawling it too much, you mean?
By crawling it too much, right? And so based on things like your server response time, how long, when they make a request, how long does it take to get a page back? Are they getting a lot of timeouts? They're going to back off the crawl if it seems like they're crawling it in a way that your server is not responding well. And this, by the way, is part of that crawl rate and control. That's part of Search Console comes in, because you can see kind of where that is set, and you can request either that they slow it down more or that they increase it. Whether or not they will, we'll probably talk about that later. But just in terms of that technical limitation.
Yeah, I found this part really interesting because a lot of people obsess over site speed. You still hear that now, but I think a lot of people have it confused. But this really seems to get more to the heart of it, which is that site speed will, if your site is slow, it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but Google will not crawl it as often. And if they don't crawl it as often, they won't discover content and they won't update content as often. Is that kind of more the point here, is that Google's trying to not slow down your site? And if you have a slow site, then they're going to crawl it less.
Well, so there's two different things to look at for site speed, and I think I may get into that in the article a little bit, which is that there's server speed, and server speed is going to impact both the ability of the search bots to crawl your site and how slow the site seems to a user. So that server speed is going to impact both those things. So exactly what you're saying. If Google's getting a slow response time from your server, they're not only not going to be able to crawl as many pages, but they're probably going to back off how much they even try to crawl. But when you look at site speed and you see this talked about, it also can mean client side speed. And so there's a lot of things that might impact how slowly a page loads for a visitor that wouldn't impact the search crawl at all. And so that's kind of a secondary set of speed things that could also, like if your page isn't loading because like the ads are stuck and all a visitor sees is a blank page, they're probably going to like bounce off that and go back and go to another search result. And so over time, that kind of stuff can impact your rankings, and that's going to be separate from kind of this crawl issue. But certainly server speed is definitely going to impact
Do you
this.
Something I'm just thinking of right now, and I've often wondered, sometimes I'll see sites that start to get a lift in traffic, whether it's through increased rankings or maybe they get a lot of links or referrals, or they're mentioned on Facebook or something. And oftentimes I'll see this surge in traffic, and then it's almost like they don't pass some kind of test, and then Google just drops it back down, sometimes even lower to where they were. Is part of that like Google saying, okay, this site got a ton of traffic, but their server or their page load is not ready to handle this, and then they back off with crawling, which might affect rankings? Or am I overreaching with that?
Yeah, that likely is not the case. I mean, that's probably not going to influence rankings, right? Because once a site's crawled, those rankings are going to be pretty steady, right? Once it's indexed. And so even if they back off the crawl because they found that they're crawling it too much, that shouldn't in turn then necessarily lower the rankings. Sometimes I think you see what you're describing. Let's say there's a new site that Google, or maybe a site that's been around for a long time, but Google just didn't know that much about it, right? It was kind of under the radar, didn't have a lot of page rank, didn't have a lot of links. And all of a sudden, right, it gets really popular. And so therefore, a lot of page rank and other signals kind of flow into the site. Google is always algorithmically experimenting with rankings, right? And so that site's pages may get a boost in rankings where it's relevant. But if the algorithms are finding that people don't click those results, then the site may not stay there, right? So they'll say sometimes, oh, it looks like this page might be, really relevant for XYZ. Oh, but no one's clicking on it. Turns out we were wrong. It wasn't relevant for XYZ. So sometimes you see the behavior you're describing for that.
It might be more of a user signal. So
yeah.
Thank you for humoring me with that question.
Sure.
I was curious. So Google recommends a certain maximum server response time. What is that? And then maybe there might be a few tips you have for people to improve that.
Well, yeah. What does Google say?
I think they say 200 milliseconds.
200 milliseconds, which again, that kind of goes back to this idea of that's when you see them talking about page speed, they'll say 2 seconds. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of understanding that's page load time versus server response time of 200 milliseconds.
Okay.
So that's what they recommend. But just like with page speed, you won't necessarily get that, right? But you can definitely use that as a gauge. I wouldn't say like, oh, if it's not there, that means that you're stuck and they're not going to crawl you. Like, what are we going to do now? But that's kind of something to aim for. I think like if your server response time was like 5 seconds for one fetch, then that's probably a real problem.
Right. Yeah. That's probably way too long. Which
again, is not the same thing as a page loading in a client in 5 seconds. Right. That might happen and that's fine. But server response time is very different. That's like when you start to get any response back at all from your server.
I see. Yeah. I think you linked to a Webmaster Help Central forum where John Mueller responded saying, at times they're seeing, okay, so the 2 seconds thing came from a specific answer to a specific question in Webmaster Central.
Well, so 2 seconds is used in 2 different ways here. So 2 seconds is what they recommend for a page load.
Okay.
But in that post, he was saying that 2 seconds was way too long for a server response time.
I see. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I think you linked to, by the way, if some of the listeners want to know how to improve their server response time, you linked to some nice resources in your article. And now talk about server errors. So that's different than the response time. What's the impact of server errors?
Yeah, so that's another thing that I think can get confused for people is like if you go to the Google Search Console or like you use a log analysis product like ours, you'll see all of the URLs that Google got an error when they tried to crawl it. And that's okay. I mean, it's not awesome, but there's various issues that have a variety of impacts, but that's okay. But URL errors and server errors are not the same thing. And actually, at some point, Google made that more obvious in their set of reports. So now they show you server errors versus URL errors.
So by that, do you simply mean like a 404 is a URL error and a server is a 500 code?
Well, server error could be, the way they have it grouped is it could be like a DNS error. It could be a server timeout. Okay. So basically they can't access the server at all.
Right.
And so like some of the 500s are actually okay, right? Like if they get a server maintenance response, they're like, oh, that's cool. I'll just leave it indexed and come back later. But when they get these full on server errors, 2 things might happen. One is they might just back off the crawl entirely. Mm-hmm. And when you look at Google, they kind of show you how many server errors, like sometimes they don't get a server error every single time they make a request. They only get it every so often. And so they'll keep crawling, but they will start to back off. So for sure, you should watch that. But an even more important thing is if they get a server error when they try to crawl the robots file, they'll completely stop crawling your site.
Oh, wait. So I think that's something important. Can you say that again? Yeah. Just so I want to make sure everyone caught that.
Yeah, so if Google gets a server error when trying to fetch your robots.txt file, they'll stop crawling your site entirely.
The entire site?
The entire site. And the logic behind that is, so again, that's not going to happen if they get a 404, right? They're fine. So basically, if Google crawls the robots file before they crawl anything else, right? Because they want to know what they're allowed to crawl before they start. So the first thing they do is they check the robots file, right? To see, okay, is it the same as it was before? Is it updated? What am I allowed to crawl? Mm-hmm. If they get a 404 when they try to request it, then that tells them we can crawl everything. There isn't a robots file. So that's cool. Like that's no problem. You get a 404, that means we're going to crawl everything. Or you get a 200, And then they read the file and go, okay, there is a file here and here's what it says. But if they get, for instance, a timeout when they try to request the robots file, then they don't know, is there a file there? Is there not a file there? And what does it say we can crawl? So if they don't get either a 404 or a 200, then they don't know anything about what might be there. And so they don't crawl anything.
Very interesting. Okay.
Sometimes the server is accidentally set up to return a weird server timeout thing when it really should be a 404, right? So when you really want to make sure that's not happening, but particularly with your robots file.
Wow, I had never heard that before. That's super interesting. And I don't think I've ever actually seen a timeout or 500 or any weird error in a robots.txt, but there's always time for everything, right? So
yeah.
What are so you mentioned about requesting a change in the crawl rate limit with that tool. It's like a little slider tool. I'm sure the listeners have seen that in Search Console. What is ever the case to use that tool? Because I believe there's a message right in there. Maybe you were a part of this that says like, warning advanced. Yeah. Like, so, and I've never actually, honestly, never used this tool myself. So what would be the case for actually using that?
Right. So the reason, first of all, the warning is there is if you set it slower, but you don't need it to be slower, Google will reduce your crawl, and that could cause pages to not be indexed, right? So the main reason you would use this for sure is if Google is crawling your site too much and you want them to crawl it less. So if Google's algorithms have not done a great job of understanding that they're crawling the site too often, you can manually tell them, hey, crawl me a little bit less. And so that's kind of the key use case for that is you can just turn the slider down a little bit and see how that does and then, adjust it down. The other key...
sorry to interrupt. I'm struggling of thinking of a reason why that would be the case. Do you have like an example?
Yeah, so people are on shared hosting. Like this isn't as common as it used to be because now you can basically get a cheap hosting, whatever. But, kind of the old free shared hosting accounts or people that have like a computer in like their basement that they're using as their server that's not very fast. Like it used to be way more common than it is now. At this point, like cloud hosting and stuff in it, inexpensive hardware, like it's hard now to get a server probably that is that fragile, but it definitely used to be way more common that you'd have a little site that just had a tiny little processor in it and like just couldn't take much. So I'm sure it still exists now, right? But yeah, you're not going to see it as often as you used to. I
believe you were going to mention one other use for the
so what people probably more often want to do is say, crawl me more, right? And so that's the one so if you say crawl me less, Google will always honor that. But if you say crawl me more, Google may or may not honor that. And that's where the crawl, demand really starts to come into play, which is that Google may know it can crawl your site a lot, but they just may not feel like they need to crawl it as much as they have the allotment for. So in those cases, even if you request an increase, they're not going to crawl it more because they already are crawling it as much as they want.
Yeah. And by the way, like I just had a funny thing run through my head, which is if Googlebot was personified, Crawl Me More would be like a great like love song, I think. It just sounds, anyways, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's funny. But if Google would like to crawl your site more, like let's say you're a really big site and Google knows about a lot more pages and they are crawling you as much as they can, but if they felt like they had more allotment, they could crawl you even more. Mm-hmm. Then if you say crawl me more, Google will start to crawl more pages. So this is generally going to be the case where let's say you have a really robust server and maybe you didn't used to, right? Like maybe you're a big site, you recently put in load balancing or, you upgraded your hardware or something. And so you might think, well, maybe Google is using kind of old signals about how much to crawl me. So you can always increase. Again, you want to be careful when you increase it to make sure that you really can handle the load, right? Mm-hmm. But so you can certainly try it if you feel like your site isn't fully indexed, especially if you have a lot of, millions of long tail pages that you feel like aren't being crawled and indexed quickly. You can try to increase it and see if they want to crawl you more.
Fascinating. Yeah. Now that's all I'm going to think of now when I hear that phrase. I'm sorry. I ruined it.
You're going to write the song now.
Yeah, I probably am. I am a musician, by the way. I don't know if you knew that. So maybe I will write that song. But just to put a little bow on the crawl rate limit, one thing I want to make sure that we explicitly said to the listeners is that numerically speaking, and you put this at the beginning, is that the crawl rate limit is the number of connections open at once. And by that, you mean the amount of simultaneous pages that Google is on at one time? Is that what you mean?
That's right. The simultaneous requests happening.
I see. Mm-hmm. And then
combined with the time between requests.
The time between. So does that mean that, I think you have an example here, but maybe they have 10 connections going. So they're on 10 pages and then they have 5 seconds between the requests. So they're going to do 10 pages, wait 5 seconds, and then do another 10 pages, wait 5 seconds. I see. Right. And then do they have a maximum amount of time, like 5 minutes they're going to spend on your site per day, or does it get macro like that?
Yeah, so that's the part they don't really say.
Okay.
Because yes, it's not 24 hours a day constantly. Right. It's not like if their connection is 10 connections at once and, half a second between fetches, they're not doing that constantly 24 hours a day, right? They might crawl it for a while and then, although, again, if you look at your logs, like if you use a product like ours, it will show you the timestamp of when Google's crawling the pages, and they are crawling them all the time, right? It's not like it's only an hour a day every morning, but it just may not be constant. Like that's the maximum at any time, but it doesn't mean that they're always constantly, because they have to crawl. I mean, they don't have an infinite number of machines, right? So they're not crawling every single site on the internet exactly all at the same time. So there's not really a way to know like how you can't necessarily calculate, okay, I know that this is the crawl rate they've set me, so therefore I get X number of pages crawled a day. Like you can get that again from looking at your logs. You can see, I see that they crawl an average, or looking even at the Google reports, they crawl me an average of X number of pages a day. So you can get it that way, but you can't really get it from this crawl rate.
Do they crawl are they for sites like the New York Times? Is that a site where they're constantly crawling them, or do they even have a limit for like the New York Times?
Well, so they've got different algorithms in place. And actually, I think John or someone from Google alluded to this recently, right? Because they've got this instant index thing, right? So for Google News and for other pages, they have kind of a separate system that might be crawling like the front page of the New York Times and getting new articles all the time. But that is going to be separate from what we're talking about here, which is just generally crawling the site and making sure that it's fully indexed and updated. And I think John or whoever talked about this, where you might see it if sometimes you have a page that gets indexed, particularly if you use the submit to index feature in Search Console, and it'll get indexed and then it'll drop out and then it'll get indexed again. And a lot of times that's because this instant indexing has grabbed it, but that's only that's not a long-term index, right? Since it's mostly used for things like news, kind of new stuff. And so this thing we're talking about here, which is the normal crawl and indexing process, is what kicks in. So you might see something get indexed right away, but normally this normal crawl indexing thing will then also index it. So when it drops out of this instant type index, you still see it indexed from this backup system, if that makes sense. But sometimes there's a lag between those two. Fascinating stuff.
So crawl demand. So if crawl rate limit is sort of a time-based definition. Yeah. Crawl demand is really more, what would it be? Popularity of the pages within your site?
Yeah. So what they want to index, what they want. What does Google care about? That's going to be a combination of things. So SEOs often, think the shorthand for this, they often use is PageRank. And of course, PageRank is a simplified way to think about it versus what Google thinks about, right? Because they're thinking of hundreds of different signals and factors. But PageRank is kind of a easy shorthand to say how popular and valuable does Google find this. So it's not only going to be PageRank as you think of it, right? It's also going to be like, well, we should probably make sure the home page of every site is indexed from the internet, right? Regardless of if that homepage has any, what you would technically call PageRank, right? So they've got other value signals like that where they say, okay, we want to make sure the homepage is indexed. We want to make sure that, anything with any links is indexed, so they kind of put together these things. And then, if it's a news site, we need to get the, at the homepage and see if there's any new news articles, and if so, get those. They've got lots of different things.
Yeah, so you're saying that they kind of have a priority list of URLs to crawl, not pages, URLs. I've got
URLs,
that distinction
that's
now.
Right.
So what happens if they start crawling your site and you've got 200 pages, but they get to 159? Do those other remaining pages, now they have to wait until the next time? And is that priority order always the same? And Google's got to end up digging deeper, or they're constantly reshuffling that?
Yeah, so they're constantly reshuffling, right? And so if they leave off at 159, that doesn't mean when they come back they're going to do 160. It means that they have a new list. I see. And so part of what goes into that prioritization is they're probably once again going to say, okay, we need to crawl the home page again, even though we crawled it last time. But part of that is, okay, here's some pages we haven't crawled in a long time, so we should probably crawl those, right? So that sorting happens dynamically all the time. And so certainly one of those factors is going to be, these are pages that are always at the end of the list. So at some point we need to recrawl them.
Yes.
But it's sort of an ever-changing thing.
And you mentioned that the only way to know, so all this stuff we're talking about, just to put a little bit of that into context, and then you've got some takeaways that I want to get to. All of the stuff we're talking about, like you said at the very beginning, you're blind to this unless you're looking at log files. Is that correct?
Well, that's right, because the thing that we're going to talk about that makes this actionable is making your crawl more efficient, right? And crawl efficiency is a factor of making sure that Google, when they crawl the list, they're crawling the pages you want. And a big thing that happens of why Google does not crawl the pages that you want is because they're crawling variations of the same page through a variety of URLs. And so with Google Search Console, you can see the errors that Google is getting, right? Which is great information. But what you're not seeing is what are all the pages they're crawling that they get a 200 response. And so if you're looking at your log files, that's where you're going to get that. So you're not only going to see, how long it takes to have certain pages be crawled, because you can see, I can see it was crawled, this week, and then, it's not going to be crawled for another month. But you can see, I can see that they're crawling all these pages that I didn't know existed, or that are, have all these weird like parameters or all these different variations. And so, without looking at that, you're pretty, blind as to what's happening. If a page isn't indexed or isn't ranking, was it crawled, but then Google didn't index it, or was it not crawled at all? It's impossible to know.
So a few takeaways. And by the way, I know we're 10 minutes to the hour here. Do you have a few more minutes after that? I had a couple other questions if you're available. I really need to start making these invites for the interviews an hour and a half, because the most recent shows we've been digging in and going longer, and I've been getting good feedback from the listeners too. And
so because you want to get, it's a lot of detail, right?
Yes, and I have some fun questions for you after this too that I didn't want to get to. That I'm fascinated to hear answers. But anyway, so let's get to, you've got a couple actionable items here. Number one, and you've alluded to this a little bit, but you're saying to make your URLs discoverable. What are some problems that lead to URLs not being discoverable?
So a lot of times you will find that pages are pretty orphaned. And so I see this more and more, right? Which is that if you can't ultimately get to a page from like a browse beginning with your homepage, it doesn't have to be linked from your homepage, right? You just have to, from your homepage, get to some link that then leads to some link that then, ultimately leads to this page you want indexed. Yes. It's surprising the number of times that's not the case, right? And so for orphan pages, if you can't browse to them, because a lot of people, right, will use a search box. A good example would be a site that has a lot of regional content, right? And so they have content in all these different like regions, like say it's a car and classifieds, right? So on the homepage, there might be a search box that you can choose. You can search on your zip code.
Yes. And
from there, you can get to a list of cars, but there's no way for like a search engine to browse or for a visitor to browse.
So an orphan page is essentially a page that there's no link path to get.
There's no link path to it, right?
Now,
so that's the best.
What if you have, sorry to interrupt again, what if you have an orphan page scenario? So I have a client right now, and we know a long-term thing for them is going to be to get their faceted navigation under control, because right now they're not really linking to all of their category pages.
Yeah.
So to mitigate that, they have an XML sitemap, but I've also had them create an HTML sitemap.
That'll definitely help.
So those two things will help to mitigate that until there's an appropriate crawl path?
Yeah, so an XML sitemap will at least get the URL to be discoverable, right? Which is the initial thing that you need, obviously. But if you've put it in your sitemap, but there's no browse path to it, then there may not be many signals that would put it up in the priority queue to get it crawled, right? So having the HTML sitemap is a good kind of fallback method until you have a better browse structure that at least links to it from the site, that gives it a little bit of a boost, so that Google knows that it's important enough to crawl.
You mentioned infinite URLs. So what is the problem with those, and how can people find these and fix them? Yeah, so this kind of gets to this idea of you want to make the crawl efficient. And so that means that you want Google not to spend a lot of time crawling pages that you don't want. And so infinite URLs, I have a few different examples here of where the Googlebot could get stuck on some loop. Kind of the quintessential example that has been around forever is the next button on a calendar, right? If you can click next forever, then Google's getting a link forever. And so, that's kind of, but there's lots of other ways. So infinite search results is a big one, where Google says, right, to block search results from crawling anyway, but a lot of sites use their search function kind of as a category page generator. Which is fine. But if infinite search results, someone could type in anything, right? It may not even be like relevant to your site, and they might get either a blank page or a bunch of results that aren't actually related to the topic. Yeah. That could be infinite, right? So you want to be able to handle that. And there's a variety of ways to handle that, right? But that would be one example. Another one would be this soft 404 example, right, where instead of returning a 404 page for something not found, it just returns a 200, but it could be anything, right? So like it could be a typo in the URL, but instead of returning a 404, it just returns some content or your homepage. So that could be another way that Google could, so there's lots of different things kind of like that, and they all have different solutions. But there's for sure solutions for all of them. I talk a little bit about them in the post. Yeah, that's one thing I always recommend is for people to check that their pages that are supposed to be broken actually return a 404 code. In fact, I had a client that had probably 200,000 quote broken pages all indexed because they all returned a 200 code at one point. He cleaned them all up and it immediately fixed his rankings at that time. And this was 4 years ago, but those types of things really help. So yeah, you do have a lot of these resources linked to. You have a nice checklist at the end of the article. So let's talk through just a few of these things. Give the listeners some quick next steps of what they can do to check for these issues and to maybe start improving some of them. Yeah. So I have the checklist at the bottom. So I basically say, assess what the current state is, right? And so you can see are all my pages indexed? And a good way to check that would be to submit an XML sitemap with all the pages you want indexed. And then Google will show you how many of those are indexed. That reminds me of one question. Again, sorry to interrupt. I'm always thinking these things. I often see in Search Console 100,000 pages submitted in the XML sitemap. But not all of them are indexed. And I always get asked about this by clients or people in the Moz Q&A. So
Sure.
Is that like, how much of an issue is that? Is that like a surface level? Is that something that's really indicating like an issue that needs to be fixed?
Well, it really depends. So the key would be that your XML sitemap only has your canonical URLs and that it's comprehensive. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, then that for sure is going to be a good metric. If only half of those pages are indexed, that means only half your site is indexed. That's a problem. But often when you see that only half the site is indexed, if you look at the sitemap, you see it's actually a problem with the sitemap where they've submitted a lot of URLs that aren't the canonical, right? That have a canonical attribute elsewhere, or a lot of pages that return a 404 or that, redirect. And if that's the case, then that is probably an accurate indexing number. So in order to really use that as a useful metric, you really need to make sure that the sitemaps that are being submitted are really a canonical list of URLs. And that often is the hardest part.
Right.
It's a really valuable thing to do because, and I always say that you should do it by category. So have your different types of pages in different sitemaps so that you can really use that indexing number like does Google.
So you actually
really like your profile pages, but doesn't like your product pages.
Yeah.
Something like that.
You actually, so for the listeners, you actually nest the sitemaps. You have a sitemap index that lists the nested sitemaps. Is that right? That's how it works?
Sure. Yeah. Each that are a different page type.
Awesome. So I want to encourage listeners to check out your checklist and the whole post. And by the way, your tool, I didn't even realize this until I was researching for the interviews. Your tool actually handles a lot of this stuff by making it possible to analyze log files. So check out Keylime Toolbox as well. One last
it'll go through and show you everything that's crawled and all the problems they're having, all the parameters, all the canonical issues, all that stuff.
I have to say, I've been doing more log file analysis. I'm being honest, I didn't know about your tool, but I'm going to check it out now. But it's been so valuable from an SEO standpoint. So I want to encourage all the listeners to do that, whether it's with this tool or check out the various options. It's really something that you need to be doing. One last question about this. And then I promise I only have 15 minutes before my next appointment, so I'm not going to keep you on the line for another hour. The most common scenario that I see needing to fix is that Googlebot is crawling a whole ton of pages that you don't want them to focus on. So and somebody asked this to you in the comments and you gave a great answer. What can somebody do if they want to discourage Google from crawling stuff that's not as important and focus on the more important stuff?
Well, so I think it depends on whether you don't want those pages indexed at all or if you do, right? If you don't want the pages indexed at all, there's a lot easier solutions, right?
Which would be to just block them or?
Yeah, so if you're concerned about crawl efficiency, then you need to block them with a robots file. I think in the comments, the guy talked about a no index attribute. And I think what people don't realize is that sometimes is that if you put a no index on a page, it's still going to get crawled, right? Because Google has to crawl it in order to extract that no index tag. So if what you're really looking to do is help your crawl efficiency by not having all those pages be crawled, then you really have to block it with robots and .txt. And in order to do that, obviously, you either need to have them in a separate folder or they need to match some kind of a pattern that your other pages don't match. And so that's not always going to be possible, right? Yes. The other time you wouldn't want to use that is if you want those pages to not be indexed, but to flow PageRank and links to other pages on your site, right? Because then you do need those pages to be crawled in order for that to happen. Right. And that's when instead you would use a no index follow attribute. So that's one thing you should do. The thing is if you, let's say they're non-canonical pages, but you still want the page rank from those variations to be consolidated into the canonical page, then again, you would use a canonical attribute and not block them. Anything with a canonical attribute or a redirect is going to be crawled less often than something that is canonical. So it's not going to keep them from being crawled at all, but it will cause them to be crawled less often.
I found that interesting. I didn't know that. So by adding the canonical or the 301, they're crawled less often.
Yeah, and that's why sometimes, too, you'll see the non-canonical pages in the index if you do a site search, right? They're not going to rank because the canonical will rank. Yes. But you'll see a cache date that's really old. And so sometimes that will come up if someone says, oh, well, these pages used to have a canonical to another page, but now I've decided I don't need these pages at all. And so now they, return a redirect. Why has Google not seen that yet? It's like, well, because it's marked as a non-canonical, it might not be crawled for 60 days or something. So it's going to take a little bit longer, which is okay again, right? But sometimes these things come up and they seem confusing to people.
Yeah, I have an easy time kind of visualizing all this stuff because I've done a lot of music production and playing around with analog synthesizers, and they all, to me, it's the same, right? It's like mechanical, but you've got to imagine it. So
exactly.
It's really fascinating stuff. I hope the listeners walking or driving in their car could follow along with all that stuff. But now I'm going to bring things back up for the last 10, 15 minutes and get a little less technical.
Sure.
One thing that I know is that you knew Rand and Moz sort of in the early days. In fact, I just want to read to the listeners. Rand wrote a review. I don't know if you call it a review or whatever of you on LinkedIn, an endorsement maybe. But it's so. Have you seen it? It's really nice. It says Vanessa is not only brilliant and dedicated, she's also one of the most friendly, approachable people you'll ever meet. I cannot sing her praises enough. She is quite possibly the finest example of why Google has had so much recent success. And I think he wrote that back around the time. You've never seen that?
I probably have. It was a long time ago, right? Yeah. But I just haven't seen it lately. It's nice. That's
I know Rand really did value your contributions to Google in the SEO world at that time. But I wanted to ask you, actually, you knew Rand and Moz really before they became big in the SEO world. Well, we're all in the same city. Right. You're in Seattle. Yep. So was there anything that you saw, and I saw an interview with you and Rand in like 2007 or something. Yeah. Did you see anything that indicated to you that this company is really going to go do important things? Like, did you see like the ingredients of what Moz has become today?
Sure, because, back in those days, there weren't a lot of tools companies, right? There's a lot more now. But I think they sort of early on saw that in addition to just SEO advice and stuff, it would be really useful to start building some tools to provide more insight. And that was way back in the early days, back when I still worked, for Google and, also was working on a tool, right? Search Console. And so I obviously saw the value of being able to take a lot of data. So it's for sure. I always thought that was great and, kind of watched that in the early days as they were getting started. And, I remember that whiteboard video and many of the early ones Rand did is that like, he's like sitting like, it looks like in a dark basement with a whiteboard and he's got his long hair and, was it really that scrappy kind of startup vibe at that time? Yeah, for sure. Yeah, they had an office over in the university district. Of course, it's not where they are now, very small office back when they had, just a few people over there. And they were getting it done, That's great. So I saw a couple other talks that you've done. I found the videos on YouTube and whatnot. And one of them, you were talking about actually, and I didn't realize this, you referenced a Slate article about the addiction of social media and whatnot. But one thing you said is that search is addictive too. And I didn't realize that. I always thought it was just social media because social media is kind of like a reactive thing. You get a message or an alert, but talk a little bit about why is search addictive as well? Yeah, so they did studies. Again, this was kind of years ago. There's probably been a lot more since then. But I gave a couple of talks kind of on this idea that searching stimulates that same reward system as in the brain as like, say, a hit of heroin. Yeah. And dopamine, so... Right? Dopamine. And so it's this idea, and I actually heard a podcast or something on it recently, this kind of same idea that it's not just stimulated by the response that you get, but kind of this idea of the searching itself, because you never know what you're going to get. It's not like a predefined reward, where it's exactly the same every time. And so you can get this thing. Certainly we use search as like a task-based thing, right? We need something specific and we search for that and we get it and we're done. But search can also be more of this, like discovery that we get from social, which has happened to all of us, right? You search for something, but then, you see something else and that leads you to want to search for something else. And so there can be a very similar experience as you get with social. It's not always just a task-based, I want this one thing and now I'm out. You could search for hours, and I certainly have done it. There's very like raccoons are super adorable, and like there's all these pictures of them, and you see these little videos of them, and then who knows where that leads.
I can relate to that, especially in many people in YouTube environment, right? I mean, you often hear the comment like you get just stuck in a endless YouTube searching frenzy. And
they make that very easy, right?
Yes,
with those related videos.
Yeah, but I did find that interesting because it speaks to, you talk about how search is so a part of our lives now, and it's really this habit. And I think that's super interesting. And another slightly similar related topic, you gave a talk where it was funny, you were in a room where you were surrounded by people all around you, and you mentioned like not knowing where to look. But in that talk, you were referring to voice search.
Yeah.
On this quote I'm going to read that you said, I think is the best explanation of putting voice search in its place. You said it's really an advancement of voice to text, not a search advancement. And by the way, this talk was like 3 years ago that you gave, and that's still so on point. But I wanted to ask you if you can expound on that a little and maybe tell us, what are your thoughts of voice search today? Is it still the same as what you said at that time?
That's interesting because I have I have that same perspective, but I also have a kind of new evolution maybe of that, which is that for sure I think was true then and still true now, that voice search is the same as a text search, right? You're just, instead of using text to input, you're using voice to input. There may be a little bit of nuance in that you might, your searches might be a little bit longer than they otherwise would be because it's easier to talk than it is to type. But ultimately, it's the same interface. You're searching for something and you get back a set of text-based results, right? And even like we're doing with mobile now, we might say, where's a pizza place near me, right? And Google has historically actually done a terrible job of that because they'll use like near me as like text. Relevance factors as text. And it's like,
do that today. In fact, I tell all my clients, I have a client that sells pianos and I said, make a page called Pianos Near Me. You'll rank everywhere for it.
You'll rank everywhere. It's kind of,
it's a loophole right now.
That's funny because Google is behind me, a Google Home, and it just, I turned her on. She just started talking in the background. Anyway, that's exactly right. And it's hilarious that is still the case, right? That they'll use near me as just look for text on the page. Although they're experimenting, I see, with doing a better job with maps where they specifically, you would think this would be built into everything. If you say near me, they'd actually see your location, but they so far haven't done that.
Yeah, I'm floored. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, so that still, I think, is the case with voice search. The new thing is actually related to the Google Home that just activated behind me, which is that now, in addition to voice search input, we have voice search output. And that's where things have changed, right? Where instead of Google showing you the 10 blue links or whatever they're showing you, they're trying to speak back her result. And so that's where things have changed because Google is, I think, really trying to figure this out. And not just them, right? Everybody that's kind of in this space. And what Google, how they've answered it so far is you can see that they've really ramped up their answer one boxes on the desktop. So it's influencing their text-based results because they need to have these answer one boxes because that's what they want. Say, I'm not going to say her name because she's going to come on again. They need these voice answers, right? And so you see on even something like a desktop search, a lot more of these answers popping up because that's what this voice response is going to say. And so that makes it, right now, it's a small percentage of searches and it's not really displacing other search. So, but at some point that's going to become more and more. And so at that, when you think about SEO for that, it's like, well, okay, I can try to make sure I've optimized to be in as a one box, because then that's going to translate to what the Google Home is going to say. But that is not likely to result in a click, right? Because you're just hearing it. In some cases, like I was looking at an example this morning with recipes. Like if you ask for a recipe, she'll give you a little information, but obviously not the whole recipe. So then you go to the app and go look at it. But that's often not going to be the case. It does say the site that it's coming from, but that's going to be a whole new thing of like, that is likely not the be all end all of what that interface is going to be. It's, I think, because they're just like starting out with it. So that's where I think things are starting to change with a voice search, is with the voice interface response.
It was interesting because in that same talk, and again, this was like 3 or 4 years ago, you said something that Google Home was not even like anywhere on the radar that I know at that point.
No, there's no Alexa or anything.
Yeah, you said the way to think about it was the internet itself changing, and you said the internet might not be what it was at that time, but where you walk into your home and the internet is like your house. And of course,
that's right.
Yeah, and you said that, and I said, "Wow, she's you." I don't know. I wouldn't go as far to say predicted, but you were really referring to like what we're seeing now with Google Home. Okay, I have one last question. I know I could ask a million more questions, and I like what you have to say. It's super fascinating, but a lot of this that we're talking about is like you were talking about these things in 2007 that we're still talking about now, like click-through rate or like voice search 4 years ago. So I'm curious, given this thinking ahead, one thing I've seen now is these new carousel results in Google where just today I typed famous speeches and now I'm getting a carousel with a box and an image of every famous speech that Google considers important to, like, what do you think about those boxes? I don't really find them super useful right now.
Well, and I think this goes back to what we were talking about a few moments ago about having search be more of a browsability behavior versus just a task-based behavior. And over the years, different search engines have tried to do this more and more. Yahoo, back when they had their own search engine, tried to do this where they tried to kind of turn the search page into more of a discovery mechanism to keep you clicking and clicking and clicking.
Right.
Historically, it has not worked very well because people were trying to use search as more of a task-based thing. Yes. Now that the internet is so ubiquitous in our lives, and since social has really trained us to be more of a browse type behavior on our phones and stuff, it may be that people are now receptive to it in search as well, because Google, just like anyone else, I mean, it's interesting. Google used to say that their main goal was to get you off the searcher page as quickly as possible. Yes. But that no longer seems to be the case. Now it seems like with these things like you're talking about, they're really trying to keep people on the search page as long as they can. And so in that example that you're giving, they're using algorithms as kind of a expanded example of what they used to do with like additional search results. You'd always see them at the bottom of the page. People that search for this also search for this. So they're trying to just build that in as more of an image-based thing, just saying, oh, okay, people who search for this thing that you search for also search for these other things, and just putting it up there so that you'll like continue to go down this rabbit hole of browsing. Yeah. And so whether or not that, like I say, I think it is more likely to work than in years past, because that is more the way that people behave on the internet. So we'll see. But again, it doesn't help sites with page views necessarily, right? It just helps the search results pages get more page views. Right. So we'll kind of see how that goes. I do think that I don't think that text-based search still is going away anytime soon, right? We definitely have more things, more interfaces and more ways of searching than we did before, but we still use our laptops, we still use our phones. But it'll be interesting to see what the next interface is after, say, a Google Home. Like, is the Google Home going to have like a projector built in where it'll like project a page on the wall, so they can combine voice and images. Like, I don't know. It's
interesting.
Right.
I had a feeling if I asked, I'd get an interesting little tidbit like that. Because I'm trying to imagine, like, I'm not a great like futurist, like at thinking of like what's coming. So I'm fascinated when people such as yourself like speak to what could be next for interfaces and things like that. That or a hologram could pop up, right? Like,
yeah. Well, I have a projector. It's a cube. It's like maybe 4 inches square, and it uses AirPlay to connect.
Oh, wow.
To your phone, and it'll project onto a wall, and it's very small, right? And so, for sure, that is a viable technology. Whether or not we go more into voice or try to keep images in, I find it hard. Like a lot of stuff we need to see, right? Yes. So it's hard to have voice only, and so I do think there's going to be more and more ways to integrate the two together in ways that are seamless in our lives. There's also, of course, going to be built into our homes more ways where we don't the web page. Yeah, like Amazon's a good example. They have those buttons, right? The dash buttons, where if you need more whatever, you just click the button. So that's kind of gone away from needing the website at all in those cases, right? And so that things like that will be built more and more into just what we're doing. Where at some point we'll have to not only think about optimizing our website, but abstracting the content or the interaction or the transaction from the web page and into these other things.
That is fascinating stuff. So I am going to end things here. I know we could probably chat longer. This has been super fascinating and interesting, and it's been great to meet you and finally chat and everything. But tell us quickly where we can find you online, your Twitter, and then just the 2 names of your books as well, if people want to check those out.
So my company is Key Lime Toolbox, so you can go to keylimetoolbox.com. Twitter is a good place to find me, which is just Vanessa Fox. My book, Marketing in the Age of Google.
2 books or 1? I thought I saw 2 in Amazon.
It was reissued. We did a second edition and issued it in paperback, so it's just an updated version for the book.
Great. I will link to that and everything we mentioned in the show notes. So again, thank you, Vanessa, for joining us, and we'll see everyone. Definitely, we'll see everyone next time. Thank you.
Thanks.
I have to ask one last little question about something of your background at Google, and then we'll get to Crawl Budget.
Yeah.
I saw somewhere there's actually an update named the Buffy update.
Yeah.
And I know what that's all about, but tell the listeners, and is that actually still an actual update that's out? Well, I've never heard of that.
The Buffy update, yeah. So you see this less often now, although you still see it. But there used to be a lot more pretty noticeable updates of Google's algorithms. Now, things with machine learning and stuff where it's built in, a lot more of the updates just happen so often that you don't see a lot of them aggregate and then get launched all at once, right? But that's kind of how it would happen more that way, right? Like any kind of a software cycle, you'd work on a bunch of stuff and then you'd have a launch, right? Now it's more like on the on the go.
They call it real time maybe or
well, yeah, kind of real time ongoing, type stuff. They still have launches, right? But it's not the way it used to be. So back in the day, it was much more obvious, right? So SEOs would always name things. You heard all kinds of names. There's naming,
Florida
there'd be some
update and Penguin update.
Right. And so they would name the somewhere like Webmaster, like World or whatever, people would come up with these names a variety of ways. And, Google would not always necessarily say, oh, yeah, that's an update, like maybe they did with Panda and Penguin.
Yeah.
sometimes they would say, oh, yeah, we did make a big update. A lot of times they wouldn't. So it just kind of coincidentally, when I left Google, there were, some algorithm things that people were like, oh, this is an update. And I really like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I would use those examples a lot in my talks or articles that I would write. So I ended up being kind of equated to Buffy, and so they called that one Buffy update because it seemed to.
So the takeaway for listeners is be careful what you put out publicly as your preferences, right? Because right. It could end up sticking.
Years later, you'll have an interview and someone will remind you. Yeah,
that's funny. So. All right, let's get to crawl budget. And I just want to set this up a little bit. So for the